There was a man who made 23 discoveries and refused, until the day he died, to explain a single one of them. Not to his wife, not to the physicians who examined him, not to the coroner who ultimately reviewed his case decades later. The only evidence he left behind was a leather-filled journal, water-damaged and partially burned, found beneath the floorboards of a shed on the outskirts of Harlan County, Kentucky, in the autumn of 1931. Whatever you're watching this on tonight, wherever you are in the world, whatever hour it is, pause for just a moment before we begin, because this story is not the kind that moves quickly. It is the kind that settles. The year was 1907. To understand what happened to Edmund Calloway, you have to first understand the world he inhabited. Not the broad strokes of American history, not the headlines, not the politics, but the specific, textured weight of daily life in the rural Appalachian foothills in the first decade of the 20th century. Because context is not background here. Context is everything. Harlan County in 1907 was a place caught between two eras. The old ways, the subsistence farming, the oral tradition, the deep Presbyterian severity that had shaped its communities since the 1790s, were still very much alive. Sunday services were long and demanding. Silence at the dinner table was a form of respect. Men did not discuss their feelings. They discussed the weather, the crops, the condition of the roads after rain. Emotional expression was not a failure of character exactly, but it was considered a kind of looseness, an unraveling of the disciplined fabric that kept a family functional through hard winters and thin harvests. And yet the modern world was arriving, whether these communities welcomed it or not. The Louisville and Nashville Railroad had extended its reach into the county. Coal companies had begun purchasing mineral rights from families who did not entirely understand what they were signing away. Surveyors were appearing on ridgelines, men with tripods and notebooks, men who measured things. The landscape was beginning to mean something different. Not just the land your grandfather cleared and your father plowed, but a resource, a commodity, a number in a ledger kept by men in offices in Cincinnati or Baltimore or New York. Edmund Calloway was, by most accounts, one of those measuring men. He was 34 years old in the spring of 1907. He had been born in Lexington, educated at the University of Kentucky in the natural sciences, and had spent the better part of a decade working as a geological field surveyor for the Appalachian Survey Commission, a quasi-governmental body funded in part by private mining interests and in part by the Federal Bureau of Mines. His work was straightforward on paper. He walked into unmapped or poorly mapped terrain, he took measurements, he recorded rock formations, water sources, soil composition, elevation changes. He drew maps. He filled notebooks. He reported back. He was good at his job. His supervisors described him in correspondence as methodical, reliable, and possessed of an unusual physical endurance. He did not complain about the conditions. He worked alone, which most surveyors of his era preferred. A second man could speed certain tasks, but a second man also meant conversation, distraction, the obligation to account for someone else's fatigue or fear. Calloway had been working solo for 6 years by the time of the 1907 survey. His wife, Margaret, lived in a rented house in Middlesbrough, a small city on the western edge of the Cumberland Gap region, approximately 40 miles from the survey area. They had been married for 5 years. They had one daughter, born in 1904, named Clara. By all surviving accounts, the letters Margaret later gave to her sister, the brief testimony she provided to the commission, theirs was an unremarkable marriage in the best sense of the word. They were fond of each other. Edmund was not a demonstrative man, but he was reliable, which in that era and that place counted for more than warmth. He left for the survey on the 14th of April, 1907. Margaret remembered the morning in her letters with a precision that suggests it lodged in her memory long after the fact, the way specific mornings sometimes do when you later understand they were the last of something. He ate oatmeal with brown sugar. He wore a grey canvas jacket over his field clothes. He kissed Clara on the forehead while she slept. He told Margaret he expected to be back within 3 weeks, possibly sooner. The survey area was roughly 12 square miles of heavily forested ridge and hollow terrain south of the Black Mountain Range, in a section that had not been formally surveyed since an incomplete effort in 1889. He took his standard equipment, a transit theodolite for angular measurements, a surveyor's chain, a hand level, a barometric altimeter for elevation readings, a compass, and his field journal, a thick-bound ledger book with water-resistant covers that the commission issued to all its surveyors. He also took a canvas pack with 2 weeks of dry provisions, a wool bedroll, a small canvas tent, a lantern, lamp oil, and a .32 caliber revolver that he had carried in the field for years and, according to his own letters to colleagues, had never once fired at anything living. He was not the sort of man who frightened easily. That detail matters. The survey area he was entering had a particular character that other surveyors had noted in passing, but never formally documented. The terrain was steep and broken, cut through with narrow hollows that channeled cold air even on warm days. The tree cover was old growth in several sections, massive tulip poplars and oaks whose canopies closed overhead with an almost architectural density, reducing the light even in midday to a dim, greenish quality that experienced woodsmen sometimes described as underwater. The local communities in the surrounding areas, small settlements with names like Bledsoe Gap and Coxton Hollow, largely avoided the interior of this terrain, not for any reason they would articulate precisely, but simply because there was no good reason to enter it. There was no grazing land there. The timber was on slopes too steep to log economically. The hollows flooded badly in spring. You went in for a reason, or you did not go in at all. Edmund Calloway went in for a reason, and for 17 days no one heard from him. That was not initially cause for alarm. Surveyors working in remote terrain could not communicate with any regularity. There were no telephone lines into those ridges. The nearest post office was a 2-hour walk from the edge of the survey zone, and Calloway had not promised to send letters, only to return. Margaret noted in her correspondence that by the end of the second week she was checking the road from the front window more frequently than she liked to admit, but that she attributed this to the normal anxiety of any wife whose husband worked in rough country. On the 2nd of May, day 18 of his absence, one of the Commission's regional coordinators, a man named Ira Bosworth, made an administrative visit to Middlesbrough and learned from Margaret that Edmund had not returned. Bosworth was not immediately alarmed either, but he sent a telegram to the nearest regional office and arranged for 2 local men, brothers named Abner and Cullen Mast, who worked occasionally as guides for the Commission, to enter the survey zone and determine Calloway's status. The Mast brothers entered the terrain on the morning of May 4th. They found him on the afternoon of May 5th, approximately 6 miles into the interior, in a section of hollow near a seasonal creek called Whetstone Branch. He was alive. He was sitting on a large flat stone near the water's edge, not injured in any obvious way, not unconscious. He was sitting upright with his hands folded in his lap, looking at the creek. Abner Mast, who gave a brief account of this discovery to Bosworth, later expanded on it in a letter to his daughter written in 1923. He wrote that when they first spotted Calloway from a distance, he looked so still that Abner assumed he was dead, that they had found a body arranged by some coincidence of the fall into a seated position. It was only when they were within 20 feet that he moved, turning his head slowly toward them. His eyes, Abner wrote, were open and aware, but there was something about the quality of that awareness that was difficult to name. He did not look confused. He did not look relieved. He looked, Abner wrote, like a man who had been expecting them for a long time and was not particularly glad they had arrived. He had been at Whetstone Branch, based on the evidence in his journal and the physical state of his campsite nearby, for at least 4 days. He had food remaining. His equipment was intact. He did not appear to have been injured. He was thinner than Margaret would later remember him being when he left. Visibly thinner, the masked brothers noted, but he was ambulatory, coherent in his speech, and physically capable of the 6-mile walk back to the edge of the survey zone, which he made the following morning. He spoke very little during that walk. Cullen Mast later told Bosworth that he had asked Calloway what had happened, whether he had been lost or hurt, and that Calloway had said in a flat and measured voice that he was fine. When pressed further, had there been an accident? Had he become disoriented? Calloway said again in the same flat tone that he preferred not to discuss it. That was a phrase he would use many times in the months and years that followed. He preferred not to discuss it. Margaret was waiting at the house in Middlesbrough when the masked brothers delivered him on the morning of May 7th. The reunion, as she later described it in letters to her sister, was not what she had imagined during the weeks of waiting. She had anticipated something. Relief, explanation, perhaps even tears, though Edmund was not a man given to tears. What she received instead was a husband who embraced her briefly and correctly, who patted Clara on the head, who ate a full meal in silence, and who then asked if he might sleep for a while. He slept for 14 hours. She noticed the journal immediately. It was in his pack when she unpacked it, and it was different from the journals he had brought back from previous surveys. Those journals were dense, orderly things, page after page of measurements, sketches, elevation notations, soil descriptions, the mechanical record of a methodical mind at work. This journal had all of that in the first section. The first 7 days or so of the survey appeared normal, professional, unremarkable. But beginning around day 8, something changed. The entries became shorter. The handwriting, which was normally small and controlled, became larger and more irregular. Some entries were only a single line. Several pages had been torn out, the ragged edges still visible in the binding. And then, beginning at what appeared to be around day 12 or 13, there were the numbered entries. Margaret did not read the journal thoroughly in those first days. She glanced at it, registered that it looked unusual, and put it back. Edmund did not ask for it, and she did not offer it to him. In the weeks following his return, the commission's investigators would ask to examine it, and Calloway would decline. It was a personal document, he said. His field measurements and official survey data were recorded separately on commission forms, which he provided without hesitation. The journal was his own. The commission accepted this, reluctantly but practically. They had his data. They had no legal mechanism to compel the journal's surrender, and frankly, the administrative machinery of 1907 was not well designed for situations that were difficult to categorize. Edmund Calloway had returned alive. He had provided his survey data. Whatever had happened to him during those 18 days was, as far as the commission was concerned, his own affair. The physicians who examined him, there were 2, one in Middlesbrough and one in Knoxville, to whom Bosworth referred Calloway as a condition of his continued employment, found nothing physically wrong with him that they could definitively explain. He was underweight, yes. He had lost approximately 14 pounds, which even accounting for the physical demands of field work was notable. His hands showed evidence of prolonged exposure to cold water. There were a number of small lacerations on his forearms and shins, consistent with moving through dense undergrowth. His heart rate was slightly elevated. The Knoxville physician, a Dr. Arthur Fenwick, who had some interest in the emerging field of psychological medicine, spent more time with Calloway than the Middlesbrough doctor had. He wrote in his notes that were preserved by his family and eventually deposited with the University of Tennessee archives in 1958, that Calloway presented with what Fenwick described, cautiously, as a fixed and deliberate withdrawal of emotional engagement. He was not mute. He was not irrational. He answered questions accurately and with apparent intelligence. But there was a quality of flatness to his responses, a kind of very controlled distance from the interaction that Fenwick found unusual in a man who had no history of mental illness and who had been functioning normally, by all accounts well above normally, prior to the survey. Fenwick asked Calloway directly what had happened in the survey zone. Calloway said he preferred not to discuss it. Fenwick pressed, gently, explaining that he was not asking for commission purposes, but for medical ones, that anything Calloway shared would remain between them. Calloway was quiet for a long moment and then said, again with that same flat precision, that he had made some discoveries and that he did not intend to discuss them, and that he would appreciate it if Dr. Fenwick would confine his questions to physiological matters. Fenwick noted this exchange verbatim in his records. He also noted that after Calloway said the word discoveries, his jaw tightened slightly, and he looked away from Fenwick and toward the window, and that this was the only moment in the entire examination when Calloway's composure showed any visible strain. 23 discoveries. That is the number that appears in the journal later for those who eventually read what remained of it. Not discoveries in the ordinary geological sense, though some of them were notated with the same precise professional language Calloway used in his survey forms. 23 numbered entries, each one dated, each one brief, each written in a hand that grew progressively less controlled as the numbers climbed. Discovery 1 through 7 appear to have been professional in nature, geological or environmental observations made during the normal course of the survey. A formation of unusual limestone composition, a spring that surfaced at an anomalous elevation, a section of forest where the soil chemistry appeared to differ from surrounding areas. These are recoverable in their way, dry, professional, the notes of a working surveyor. Discovery 8 is where the journal changes register. It is a single sentence. Found evidence of prolonged habitation in a location that should not have been habitable by a population that should not have been there. He does not elaborate. He does not name a location precisely enough to identify it on a map. He moves immediately to Discovery 9, which is a brief, oddly clinical description of a physical object. The journal says only, a child's shoe, single, right foot, leather, size consistent with a child of approximately 5 years, in excellent condition despite apparent age. He does not say how old he thought the shoe was. He does not say where he found it. He notes only that it was the first of what he came to think of as the secondary discoveries. The secondary discoveries, numbers 9 through 23, are the ones that were eventually transcribed by the archivist who processed the journal after its recovery in 1931. They are fragmentary, partly because several of the intervening pages were torn out, and partly because the writing in the later entries is damaged by water, and in some sections nearly illegible. But what survives forms a pattern that is coherent enough to be deeply unsettling precisely because it is not dramatic. It does not read like the record of a man in a horror story. It reads like the record of a man conducting a systematic inventory of something he encountered and could not entirely process. A set of marks on a rock face that he described as deliberate but not consistent with any tool he was familiar with. A circular clearing, roughly 40 feet in diameter, where the undergrowth grew densely around the perimeter but not within it, and where the soil was darker than the surrounding earth. A series of small stone arrangements, not cairns he specifies, but something else, though he does not specify what. A smell. He devotes an unusually long entry to a smell that he encountered in one of the deeper hollows, a description that is worth quoting in the fragmentary version available. Not rot, not sulfur, not any biological process I can name with confidence. Persistent, strongest near the water. It did not cause nausea. It caused something I am unable to name precisely, a strong disinclination to continue in the direction from which it came. A sound, also given a lengthy entry, and also described in terms of negation. Not an animal, not wind, not water, not a human voice in any register or configuration I have encountered. Repeated at intervals, I was unable to determine as regular or irregular. Present for 4 consecutive nights. And then, Discovery 23, the final entry in the numbered sequence, written in letters larger and more deliberate than anything else in the journal, as if he were writing slowly and carefully to ensure legibility. It reads, "Have decided not to record the nature of this discovery in any document. Have decided not to speak of it to any living person. This decision is final, and I understand the consequences of it." He then wrote, beneath that, in what appears to be a different ink and possibly a different pen, suggesting it was added at a later time, perhaps after he had returned to Whetstone Branch, where the masked brothers found him sitting and waiting. Some things become a man's private business, whether he chooses them to or not. The town of Middlesbrough absorbed Edmund Calloway's return in the way that small communities in that era absorbed unusual events, which is to say, through a process of gradual, informal accumulation of detail that was never documented, but that shaped perception nonetheless. People talked. The masked brothers talked discreetly, but they talked. Margaret's sister talked. The physicians, who were bound by some form of professional discretion, but who were also human, allowed certain impressions to circulate. By summer of 1907, there was a general awareness in Calloway's social world that something had happened to him in the survey zone, that he had refused to discuss it, and that he was different in some way from the man who had left in April. The nature of that difference was difficult to describe. He continued working for the commission, not field work initially, but administrative and cartographic work in the Middlesbrough office, which Bosworth arranged partly out of practical need and partly, one suspects, out of a desire to keep Calloway close and observable. He came to work on time. He did his work competently. He spoke when spoken to. He ate his lunch at his desk. But there was something about him, a quality of attention that had shifted. He had always been a quiet man, but there is a difference between the quietness of a man who is comfortable in silence and the quietness of a man who is guarding something. The colleagues who worked with him in those months later described, separately and with a consistency that is striking, the sense that Calloway was always listening, not to the conversation at hand, but to something else, something outside the room, or outside the building, or outside the ordinary range of audible sound. He had developed certain habits that had not existed before the survey. He slept, Margaret noted, with the bedroom window closed regardless of the season. In a house with no electric light, the bedroom at night would have been nearly perfectly dark when the window was shuttered, and yet he slept apparently without difficulty. He ate meals in a specific order that she could not identify a logic for. He walked to and from the commission office by the same route every day, never varying it, even when that route was less convenient or when road conditions might have suggested an alternative. When she once asked him about this habit, he looked at her for a moment and then said that he found it useful to minimize unpredictability. He said this as if it were perfectly ordinary. He was also, in this period, conducting research. This is perhaps the detail that most complicates any simple psychological reading of his behavior. If he had merely retreated into routine and silence, one might conclude, as Dr. Fenwick's notes suggest, that he was managing a traumatic experience through the mechanisms of control and avoidance that were available to men of his generation and culture. But he was also actively seeking information. He made trips to the Lexington Public Library, which required an overnight journey by rail. He made 2 trips to the Library of Congress in Washington in 1908 and 1909. Requests that required him to take leave from the commission and which Margaret understood only vaguely. He told her he was pursuing independent geological research. He corresponded under a name she did not recognize with several individuals whose letters arrived at a post office box he had opened without her knowledge, a fact she discovered only after his death, when she was settling his affairs. The letters to and from the post office box were not preserved. At some point, it is impossible to say when, they were destroyed. Whether by Calloway himself or by someone else is unknown. What Margaret did discover, in a locked metal box in the shed where the journal was eventually found, was a collection of documents in Edmund's hand that appeared to be the results of his research. These were notes, loose sheets, filled on both sides with his small, precise writing, that referenced a range of historical and ethnographic sources. Cherokee accounts of the Black Mountain region collected by Bureau of American Ethnology field workers in the 1890s. A fragmentary 1851 survey report that described evidence of irregular settlement patterns in the upper whetstone drainage, origin unknown. A journal article published in an obscure Kentucky geological periodical in 1897 that discussed anomalous magnetic variations in a section of Harlan County that, when plotted against a modern map, appears to correspond precisely to Calloway's 1907 survey area, and clipped to these notes in an envelope sealed with wax. Wax, in 1907, which was already an archaic practice, as if he were sealing something he wanted to be sure had not been opened, was a letter. A handwritten letter on plain paper, undated, addressed to no one, unsigned. The handwriting was Edmund's. It read, "I have spent 4 years attempting to determine whether what I found is unique to that location or whether similar findings have been recorded elsewhere. I have found 6 independent references that suggest it is not unique. I have found no reference that explains it. I have reached the conclusion that explanation may not be the appropriate framework. What I found does not ask to be explained. It asks only to be left alone. I intend to leave it alone. I intend, insofar as I am able, to leave this inquiry alone as well. I recognize that I have failed repeatedly at the latter intention. I will try again." He wrote that letter based on the evidence of his research chronology, sometime around 1911. He lived until 1928. He tried, for 17 more years, to leave it alone. The record suggests he did not entirely succeed. The behavioral patterns that Margaret and his colleagues observed in 1907 and 1908 did not resolve over time. Some of them moderated, the rigid route walking, the window habit, but others persisted or evolved. He developed over the course of the following decade what can only be described as an elaborate system of notation that he applied to his personal life as well as his professional work. Small marks, made in pencil, on the doorframes of the house. A series of measurements, recorded monthly, of distances between fixed objects in the rooms he occupied most, the desk in his study, the kitchen table, a large oak tree in the backyard. These measurements, discovered after his death in notebooks he kept separately from the journal, showed no variation over years. The distances never changed. Margaret, when asked about this by the commission investigator who reviewed Calloway's papers in 1931, said that she had known about it but had never asked him to explain it, because she had learned by then that asking Edmund to explain things did not produce explanations. It produced silence, or the phrase he preferred, or on a few difficult occasions a look that she described as, she paused here in the transcript, and the investigator noted the pause. A look as if I had asked him to open a door he had decided should stay closed, and as if he was very, very afraid of what was behind it, but that he would die before admitting to fear. He returned to the survey zone once. This is documented. In September of 1913, he submitted a formal request to the Commission for permission to conduct a follow-up survey of the whetstone drainage area, citing incomplete data from the 1907 survey. The Commission approved it. He entered the survey zone on September 9th. He returned on September 11th, 2 days later, having evidently not gone far into the interior. His survey notes from those 2 days are in the Commission archive. They are ordinary. They record geological measurements of a section of terrain near the eastern edge of the survey zone, well short of Whetstone Branch, and well short of any area that would correspond to his 1907 secondary discoveries. He was asked by Bosworth whether he had found what he needed. He said that he had confirmed that certain things had not changed. He never requested permission to return to the zone again. There is a quality to suppressed knowledge that the people around the suppressor tend to register even without understanding it. Margaret understood it. Their daughter Clara, who was a perceptive child and who grew into a perceptive adult, understood it in her own way. In a memoir she wrote in her 70s, unpublished, shared only with family, Clara described her father as a man who seemed to carry a weight that had no corresponding visible burden. He was not visibly unhappy. He was not visibly frightened. He was contained. But the containment itself was visible, in the way that a sealed vessel is distinguishable from an empty one, not by what you can see inside it, but by the quality of its sealedness. He was a good father, she wrote, within the limits of what he was able to offer. He taught her to read maps. He taught her the names of rock formations and the logic of watershed topography. He taught her chess. He read to her in the evenings from history and natural philosophy. He was, she wrote, consistently present in the ways that could be scheduled. What he could not offer was a kind of unguarded openness, a willingness to be surprised, to be caught off guard, to let a moment be more than what he had anticipated it would be. Every moment, Clara wrote, seemed to have been prepared for. There was never the sense that her father experienced anything without having, somewhere in the structure of his preparations, already accounted for the possibility. She connected this, in her memoir, explicitly to the survey. She did not know what had happened. She did not speculate, she said, because her father had not speculated, had not offered a single thread she might have followed. What she knew was that before April of 1907, there were photographs of her father in which he looked like an ordinary man in ordinary moments, candid, undefended, occasionally caught mid-laugh. After that date, there were no such photographs. Every photograph of Edmund Calloway after 1907 showed the same quality: awareness of the camera, awareness of the moment, a face that had arranged itself into an appropriate expression before the shutter fell, as if he had permanently lost the capacity to be caught. The community's relationship to the survey zone itself is worth noting, because it evolved in a way that was almost certainly influenced by Calloway's behavior, without any direct causal statement being made. The Mast brothers stopped accepting guide work in that area after 1910, citing vaguely increased work demands elsewhere. The commission made no further solo surveyor deployments to the whetstone drainage zone. All subsequent survey work in the vicinity used two-person teams, a policy change that was attributed in internal documents to safety improvements, but that had no corresponding policy change in comparable terrain elsewhere in the region. The coal company that had been most active in pursuing mineral rights in the area quietly let several of those leases expire in 1912 and 1914 without explanation in the available corporate records. None of these things is inexplicable individually. Taken together, they suggest that some form of informal, unspoken consensus had formed, not about what Calloway had found, because no one knew what he had found, but about the zone itself. As if his refusal to explain had communicated, more effectively than any explanation could have, that the zone was a place that did not benefit from close attention. Edmund Calloway retired from the commission in 1924 at the age of 51 on the grounds of declining health. Dr. Fenwick, who had continued to see him periodically over the years as a general physician rather than a psychiatric one, noted in his records from this period that Calloway was suffering from a chronic insomnia that had worsened progressively over the preceding 5 years. He was sleeping by 1924 approximately 3 to 4 hours per night, and these hours were, he told Fenwick, not continuous but achieved in short intervals that he characterized as adequate. Fenwick asked him once more, in 1924, 17 years after the initial examination, whether he wished to discuss what had happened during the 1907 survey. He asked it differently this time. He did not ask what Calloway had found. He asked only whether Calloway was all right, whether in the full accounting of a life he considered himself to be a man who was all right. Calloway thought about this for what Fenwick described as a very long time. Then he said, "I am a man who has maintained his responsibilities. I have provided for my family. I have done my work. I have not harmed anyone." He paused. Whether that constitutes being all right is a question I'm not equipped to answer. He died in March of 1928. He was 54 years old. The cause of death recorded was cardiac failure, which was a broad and commonly applied category in that era, and which may or may not have captured the full picture. He died in the night, in the bed he shared with Margaret, who woke to find him not breathing sometime before dawn. Clara, who was 23 at the time and living nearby, came to the house within the hour. She described her mother as composed, unnervingly so, as if, Clara wrote, she had been expecting it for a very long time. He had left no will, no letters, no explanatory documents. There was only the locked metal box in the shed, which Margaret found 3 days after his death, when she was beginning the practical work of settling his affairs. She opened it with a key she found in his desk drawer, labeled simply with a date, May 7th, 1907, the day the masked brothers had brought him back from the survey zone. The key had been in that drawer, labeled with that date, for 21 years. The box contained the research notes, the sealed letter, and the journal. Margaret read the journal. She told Clara she had read it. She did not tell Clara what was in it. When Clara asked, Margaret said that she thought some things were a man's private business, even after death, and that she intended to honor that. She put the box back in the shed, under the floorboards, where it remained until 3 years later when the shed was being demolished and a workman found it. The commission investigator who reviewed the documents in 1931 prepared a summary report that was filed and then, for reasons that are not entirely clear, reclassified as administrative rather than archival, meaning it was subject to routine destruction after a retention period that would have elapsed sometime in the 1950s. Whether it was in fact destroyed, or whether it survives somewhere in the dispersed and inconsistently catalogued holdings of whatever agency eventually absorbed the Commission's records, is unknown. Dr. Fenwick's notes survived because his family kept them. The masked brothers' letters survived because their descendants kept them. Clara's memoir survives because she gave copies to her children. The journal itself, water-damaged and burned, as the initial description noted, survives in fragmentary form, because the archivist who processed the 1931 discovery made a partial transcription before the original document was apparently lost in a subsequent transfer of custody. Apparently lost. That phrase appears in the archival record with a tentativeness that is itself interesting. Documents do not often appear to be lost. They are lost, or they are found, or they are deliberately destroyed. The apparently suggests someone was not entirely certain which of those categories applied. The question that any serious examination of this material eventually arrives at is not what Calloway found. We cannot know that. The journal's 23rd discovery is unrecorded by design, and whatever secondary evidence might have existed, photographs, samples, additional notes, Calloway evidently ensured did not survive him. The question, rather, is what the experience of knowing but not telling did to a man over the 21 years between his return from the survey zone and his death. The evidence suggests it was not a simple burden. It was not the weight of a guilty secret in the ordinary sense. Calloway had not committed a crime, had not harmed anyone, had not, so far as anyone could determine, done anything in that hollow except observe and then withdraw. The weight he carried was of a different order. It was the weight of knowledge that had no available context, knowledge that could not be filed under any heading he possessed, knowledge that had, as the sealed letter suggests, defied 4 years of research and the apparent consultation of every relevant source he could identify. There is a particular psychological cost to carrying something you cannot explain and cannot share. The mind does not simply set such things aside. It returns to them. It measures them as Calloway measured his furniture, his door frames, the distances between fixed objects in the rooms of his life, not to find variation, but to confirm that nothing had changed, to confirm that the world was still the size and shape it had been before the discovery was made, that the doors were still the right distances from the walls, that the tree was still in the same place, that the thing he had found in the hollow near Whetstone Branch had not somehow followed him home and rearranged his ordinary life into something he would no longer recognize. This is speculation, but it is grounded speculation, drawn from the available record of a man whose behavior, described consistently by multiple independent witnesses over 2 decades, points in a coherent direction. He was maintaining, with great deliberateness and considerable effort, the structure of a normal life around an interior that had been permanently altered. Not broken. He was not a broken man by the evidence. Operational, even careful, even in some ways effective, but altered, as if the instrument of his self had been recalibrated to a reference point that no one else could see, and he was spending the remainder of his life measuring everything else against that invisible fixed point and making sure, always making sure, that the measurement still came out right. Clara, at the end of her memoir, wrote a single page about what she wished she had asked him. She was in her 70s when she wrote it, and she was clear-eyed about the fact that he would not have answered. But she wrote it anyway, as an exercise in grief that had waited decades to find its form. She wished she had asked him whether he had been afraid. Not during the survey. That wasn't what she meant. She meant afterward. She meant during the 21 years of closed windows and fixed routes and monthly measurements of unchanged distances. She wished she had asked whether the containment had been hard to maintain, or whether it had eventually become simply the condition of being him, as natural and as permanent as his name. She suspected, she wrote, that it was the latter, that by the end he was no longer maintaining something so much as inhabiting it, that the locked rooms of his experience had become simply the architecture of the man, not separate from him, not in tension with him, but structurally him, the way a building is its walls. And yet, the key labeled May 7th, 1907, 21 years in the drawer. He had kept the date on the key. He had not relabeled it as something administrative or neutral. He had kept the specific date, the date of his return, the day the masked brothers walked him out of that hollow, written in his own hand, on a physical object he handled routinely for more than 2 decades. That is not the behavior of a man who has entirely integrated his experience. That is the behavior of a man who needed, in some way he could not articulate, to remember when it began. There is, in the partial transcription of the journal, one entry that has no discovery number. It is not in the numbered sequence. It appears on a page that seems, from the transcription notes, to have been positioned after the 23rd numbered entry, but before the 2 handwritten sentences about private business. It is a single word, written 3 times, each time slightly larger than the last, as if being tested for adequacy and found wanting. Enough, enough, enough. No one who has studied this material has been able to determine with confidence whether that word was an instruction to himself, a response to something he had just recorded, a response to the thing he had decided not to record, or simply an expression of a feeling so complete and so specific that only a single word, repeated, could approximate its shape. What it meant, in the hollow near Whetstone Branch in the spring of 1907, to a methodical and careful man who had walked into unmapped terrain with his theodolite and his compass and his 2 weeks of provisions and his unfired revolver. What it meant when the thing he found exceeded the capacity of his professional language, exceeded the capacity of his personal language, exceeded finally the capacity of any language he possessed, until all that remained was this one syllable, this one flat stone of a word on which he stood above the water, waiting for 2 men he had never asked for to come and lead him back out. We do not know. We will not know. That may be, in the end, exactly what he intended. There is one detail that Clara did not include in her memoir. It was shared verbally to a researcher who contacted her in 1981 and preserved only in that researcher's unpublished notes. Clara said that once, years after her father's death, she had gone back to look at the old survey maps of the Whetstone drainage area. She was not sure what she was looking for. She was simply drawn to look, in the way children of difficult fathers are sometimes drawn to the places those fathers would not explain. She found that the area corresponding to Calloway's 1907 survey, the interior terrain, the deep hollows, the sections that would correspond to his secondary discoveries, had been surveyed twice more after his 1907 work, once in 1919 by a 2-person commission team, once in 1924 by a different agency entirely under a program she could not fully identify from the document headers. Neither survey produced complete data for the interior sections. Both surveys were designated incomplete. Both survey teams had returned early. Neither surveyor, Clara told the researcher, had offered an explanation. The researcher asked Clara what she thought that meant. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said that she thought it meant some places have a way of maintaining their own privacy. that her father had understood that his decision to keep what he found to himself was perhaps not only a choice, but also, in some way she could not quite name, a kind of honor, an honoring of something that had made it very clear it did not wish to be explained. Then she said, "But I still wish he had told me, and that is the thing that remains. Not the discoveries, not the hollow, not the sound that was not an animal, and not wind, not the smell that caused a strong disinclination to continue, not the marks on the rock face and the clearing where nothing grew, and the child's shoe in excellent condition despite its apparent age. All of that is gone, or hidden, or simply irretrievable. What remains is a daughter in her 70s who spent 60 years wondering what her father had seen, and who suspected, with the wisdom of age, that the not knowing had protected her, and who was grateful for the protection, and who mourned it anyway. That is what 21 years of silence costs. Not the man who keeps it, the people who live alongside it, who learn to navigate its rooms, who inherit its architecture when he is gone, and who stand in the empty house of it long after the door has closed, still listening for something they have no name for, in the direction he would not point.